Welcome to Tripping Over Love, where we talk all about breakdowns, breakups, and breakthroughs. I'm Courtney Corona with Keith Miller.
Hey, so today we're talking to Charles Fernyhough. He's over in the UK, and we were lucky to have him to talk about Voices Within. He's the author in 2016 of the book called The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves.
Yeah, and even though that 2016, a while ago, it's a really new topic and something that's really picking up steam right now. So it was a fascinating conversation, one that I think is really important because it really speaks to the point that the more you know, the more you learn, the more open you are to possibility and what things can look like. And that theme kept resonating with me as he was talking. And hopefully as we understand the brain a bit more, we can be more open to what's actually happening in there.
Yeah, and I really love this idea that we can interact. Of course, you know, this is what I do with people in my clinical work, but that we can interact with ourselves, that it's not just a deck of cards that we're handed and that's who we are. And we are becoming something new every day, and it really changes depending on how much we interact in some part that affects it. So he's the author of many other books, but I think you'll enjoy this conversation about the voices within. Welcome, Dr. Charles Fernyhough. It's so great to have you. How are you today?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome. You caught my attention when I don't know what I was reading that led me down this path of why your article would pop up. But you wrote an article in Nature a while back about voices in our head, and that intersects a lot with a lot of conversations we have here about internal dialogue, how it helps us get to know ourselves better and relate to others better. So I'm really curious about that article, but tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do and how you ended up writing about that topic.
Sure. I'm a professor of psychology at Durham University in the northeast of England. And I got into this line of research through studying children and looking at how children talk to themselves when they're busy with a task, when they're just chilling out, when they're just playing, hanging out with their friends, all the different ways in which children seem to use language as a way to regulate their own behavior, regulate their own emotions. So the simplest and the most powerful theory we have on this comes from the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who was writing about 100 years ago, before his untimely early death. And Vygotsky had a really neat, simple theory about how all this stuff works. He argued that babies are born into a social world. They start interacting socially from day one, or from before day one, as we now know, in terms of how mothers communicate with their babies whilst they're still in the womb. Babies are pre-programmed, if you like, to be social beings, to interact socially. And as soon as language kicks in, which for most babies is around about age 1, those interactions with others start to become linguistic interactions. They start to become social dialogue, as we call it. So babies are talking in words to other people, primarily their caregivers, often their mums. Over a period of time, children get the idea that they can use language to regulate their own behavior, just in the same way as their parent might use language to regulate their behavior. So the parent might say, how about doing this, or how about not doing this, and that sort of thing that you get in a social context. In time, children learn to turn those words back on themselves and use words to control what they themselves are doing. And this leads to a phase of development that Vygotsky called in those days it was called egocentric speech. What we call it now is private speech. So it's where children are talking to themselves out loud. There may well be other people around, but the words are for themselves. And you can really catch this if you've got access to a small child, a preschooler. Just watch them, just listen to them. And a lot of the time you'll probably find they are talking to themselves, and they're not talking to you. They're interested in you, and they may be doing it because you're around, but the words are for themselves. So Vygotsky argued that this kind of speech develops out of those social dialogues that they were previously having with their parents, their caregivers. So private speech is like the second stage in the process. You start off with social speech, you move to private speech around about the preschool years, and then there's a third stage. In time, particularly as children become enculturated, when they go to school, when they learn that, you've got to get your head down and get some work done, those out loud conversations with the self become silent conversations in the head. And that's the stage that we call inner speech. So when I was starting out, pretty much nobody was thinking about inner speech, because everybody said you can't study inner speech because it's unobservable. You can't look into somebody else's mind, thank goodness, and see what they're thinking. We'd all be in trouble if that were possible. So people would assume, people would assume
maybe
you can't.
One day we'll be in trouble.
People would assume you can't study this stuff. So my way into it was to say, okay, well, what you can do is study what children are saying, and you can study the stage of private speech, and you can infer, just like Vygotsky had done, that private speech is a precursor to inner speech. So if you can find out something about private speech, you might also find out something about inner speech. And that insight has been incredibly fruitful, because it means that not only have we studied private speech in children, I mean, this is what my PhD was about. I was watching kids playing with their parents and recording them, playing them back, coding what they were saying, studying this kind of private speech. But we can now also study inner speech, the silent stuff that goes on in the head, and we can do it through all sorts of different methods. We have more methods now than we used to have when I was starting out. For example, we have neuroimaging methods, neurostimulation methods, different things like that. But we, all those years ago when people said you can't have a science of inner speech, we've shown that you can have a science of inner speech, and there's a lot of research on this topic now, and it's still not a massive field of research, but it's a much more popular field of research than before, and more research is published every year into this topic.
One of the things I found really fascinating is you were talking about how inner speech is this is probably the wrong words, but is a dialogue or almost a debate. You bring in different perspectives, right? So can you talk about that a little bit more? Because as I was reading that, I was like, oh, interesting. I feel like my inner thoughts are very affirmative and it's one-sided, but what's really happening as those thoughts are coming to you?
So if Vygotsky is right about where inner speech comes from, there are some really, really deep implications of that view. And I guess I've spent my career trying to unpick some of those implications. And one of the most important ones to answer your question there is that if private speech and then inner speech develop from social dialogue, it should retain something of the quality of a social dialogue. So it should actually be like a conversation with another person. And so I've really zoomed in on that dialogic structure of inner speech and testing to see whether it's actually true. Was Vygotsky right in this sense? And what are the implications of that? What does that mean for the way our minds work? And I'd say we have uncovered, it's still pretty hard to do research on inner speech. There are all sorts of challenges. But we have found evidence that a lot of people do report having a kind of internal dialogue that is like a conversation with another person. It has the same kind of structure, that same sort of give and take, to and fro structure of a conversation with another person. And if that's the case, I've argued that that brings all sorts of qualities and potential, and it unlocks the mind in a way that I think if you didn't have dialogic inner speech, you'd have to find another way of doing certain things. So one of the things that I think is particularly important about dialogue is that it's both creative and it's open-ended. We're having a dialogue now, or a trialogue. We didn't know where this conversation was going before we started it, and we don't know where it's going to end. We will create something in this conversation. We will go somewhere where we can't currently see the end point. That's the wonderful thing about dialogue. You don't know where you're going with it, but you often do some
Let me
pretty
ask you about that.
Cool things with it.
Yeah, if I can ask you about that. So, and I'm not going to diagnose Courtney here, but it's what she was saying, and she said this to me before, because she'll say to me, do you just have a constant voice? She'll ask me, like, do you have a constant voice that's always talking about everything that's happening, narrating everything? And I don't. I occasionally do when I'm working on something.
I'm so jealous of that.
When I'm focusing on something, I can relate to that description, but in my free time, no, it's very subtle, and it's very it's very invisible to me. But you mentioned, Charles, that perhaps our early caregivers' form of dialogue with us might influence the kind of dialogue we have. And if you have a parent that's very dialogical and interactive, in terms of play and very, very giving, very, very big with mindsight, the ability to kind of anticipate what someone is thinking and participate with them. Would that affect Courtney's brain? Basically, can we trace it back to the kind of parenting styles we had?
Well, you would think so. You would expect to see those connections, those traces of developmental influence. Actually, we haven't got very far in answering that question. We don't have strong evidence that the kind of upbringing you have leads to a particular style of inner speech. And I think in a way, I'm not too hopeful of finding that sort of correlation, just because our minds are so complex and messy and wonderful and diverse. Right. But I think you would expect, certainly if a child were growing up in a context where they never had any dialogue with anyone, you really would expect there to be differences in the way that child developed dialogic inner speech and inner speech in general. But we don't have good evidence there's some tantalizing evidence around cultural differences where children have different roles in society in certain cultures, pointing to there's being something out there, but really we haven't looked at it closely enough. This field of inner speech research is still pretty young, and we haven't really tackled that yet.
There's a phenomenon I want to talk about, inner conflict, because that's one of the main things in my clinical work. People come in, they say they're depressed, they're anxious, they're struggling in relationships, they're angry, they're dealing with anger issues or substance abuse. And what I find through doing the work that has actually taken off explosively in the last 10 years, has been around for about 40 years, is this clinical style of interacting with people in a counseling session to facilitate their own conversations with themselves, different parts of themselves. It's similar to Gestalt, which has been around. Gestalt meaning that it's a German word for the whole, as in the sum of the parts is not the whole. So there's the you observing, and then there's the parts, and those are actually different things. There's the you that's observing is not exactly one of your parts. It's the whole. And so we use this rather systematic approach to introduce people to this skill. In fact, it's often an eye-opening experience of how stark these polarities are, how escalating, one voice tends to escalate the other on the opposite side. I really, really want to do my homework and get everything done, but I also really, really want to do nothing and party all weekend. And the more I listen to this voice, the more the other voice gets louder, and then that gets louder, so then it's harder to listen to it. So it becomes very chaotic. Can you speak to conflict, and what has your research shown about inner conflict and how that emerges?
Well, I guess one point to make is that a dialogue, by definition, involves an opposition of perspectives, not necessarily a disagreement, but two different perspectives coming into opposition, coming into interaction with each other. That's what a dialogue is. If you and I occupied exactly the same position in the world, we wouldn't be able to have a dialogue, because you would be me and I would be you. That wouldn't go anywhere. It's because you're different to me and you're standing somewhere different and you've come from a different place that we can have a meaningful dialogue.
Thank God we are not a singularity.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you've watched, the great show pluribus, where that's exactly the conceit that that humankind mostly does become that singularity. And it's pretty boring, yeah? You know, if you watch the show, those guys are not having a great deal of fun because they're all thinking with one mind. So it's because we come from different places that we can have these creative, and I'd stress the term creative. I think this is largely how human beings become creative, because they're able to have these dialogues with each other, but also then ultimately with themselves. So there's something about dialogue that is rooted not necessarily in conflict, but in difference, in differences of perspective. And of course, they can become conflictual as well. And I'd say that in clinically speaking, I do clinically related work. I'm not a clinician, but I do work that's related. I'd say the inner speech stuff isn't really a theory, or isn't really about proving one particular clinical approach over another. What it is doing is saying, here is the basic kind of infrastructure that you need to be able to have an internal dialogue about anything. And I guess what you guys can do is make use of the fact that people can do internal dialogue. They may not be very aware of it. Most people are not very aware of their inner speech and what it's like. So I guess part of your role is to help people to become aware that there is such a thing that they can engage in.
Right.
And then it can have beneficial ends in terms of being a way of sorting ourselves out.
Right. I'll illustrate a little bit the typical presentation as it spans across X amount of people that come in, is that some people, when this is introduced, this concept of inner dialogue, and that we're going to pay close attention to it, and that curiosity and facilitation between the different voices is actually possible and leads to the creative outcomes you're talking about. Some people, and I wonder what you think about this as far as why this is, some people say, oh my God, you mean to tell me I'm not crazy? Like that's how I run my life.
I was just thinking there has to be a stigma around this in some
so many people.
world.
Yeah, so many people think that it's just them, and it's sort of a bizarre thing. And I will say that I find a correlation between early trauma and a more florid ability to have these imaginative conversations, the degree of dissociation they may have while they're having this conversation, the removal of their, ignoring outside inputs, does seem to correspond to level of trauma. People who have an early trauma history may be very closed and shut down on the one hand, but others would have developed this very florid, kind of like an escape to deal with all of it. And they're very relieved oftentimes when I say, no, that is a gift. That's something we want to use. We'll help often they need help slowing it down and kind of organizing it. But other people will say, wait, this sounds weird. Like, this seems like schizophrenia or psychosis in some way. So, can you speak to that? Like, what makes one person more, amenable to this?
Yeah, people have very interesting attitudes to their inner speech, to their private speech. When I was growing up, people used to say talking to yourself is the first sign of madness. And, I think I've disproved that with my career, and that I've spent my career looking at how people talk to themselves, and they're doing it a lot of the time for really positive ends. There are some negative sides to it as well, which we can come on to. But yeah, absolutely. People have different ideas about it. People don't think about their inner speech very much. I mean, one of the most pleasant things about when my book came out, The Voices Within, people would come to me and say, I read your book, and for 3 days afterwards, I just couldn't function. I was constantly thinking about my own thoughts and thinking,
Yes.
A thought would come into my head, and I'd say, is that a bit of internal dialogue, or is that condensed, or whatever? And then they kind of worked through it, and then by the end of it, they had a completely renewed idea of their own mind. They were much more at home in their own mind. They were much more ready to enjoy the diversity of their own experience, and found it a very positive thing on the whole. So people don't pay that much attention to inner speech. And I guess, as I say, one of your roles is to help people to bring that out as a useful tool that you can use. But another thing to say is that this isn't for everyone. Not everybody uses inner speech. we're pretty bad at knowing whether we're using it or not. And I'm always quite suspicious when people give me very firm judgments about what kind of mind they have. Because I probably used to do this. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, I probably would have said, yeah, I'm doing inner speech the whole time. But some of the research I've been involved in has led me to doubt that, and led me to doubt that I'm actually a very good judge or witness at all to what's going on in my head. And that what you have to do is be a bit clinical about it and a bit of a scientist about it, and say, don't assume that you're doing inner speech all the time. Look to see, be honest with yourself about how much you're doing it and all the other different kinds of things that you're doing. So it is important to point that out, that not everybody does it a lot. I mean, Keith, if you say you're not doing it a lot, then you that's completely normal. And Courtney, if you're saying you are doing it a lot, that's completely normal as well. There is just this huge diversity.
It's so interesting. I was thinking while you were talking about this before, so to your point of, as you learn more, I can imagine myself analyzing then what I'm thinking, what I'm saying. So how has that evolved through your career as you've been researching all of that? Because I would become obsessed with what's happening and analyzing that. But do you feel more at home in your head than where you started?
Yeah, I think so. I think I enjoy the diversity of my own mind. I think there are wonders there. There are great strengths. There are things that I can use to all sorts of positive, creative ends. There are also pitfalls and dangers, and there are things, I know when I'm beating myself up too much. I generally think that just knowing more about how the mind works in this respect is beneficial. I think it's a well-being thing. It isn't a therapy. It's not trying to fix a particular problem. It's just saying, let's be more aware of this wonderful diversity that's going on in our heads. And I think that can have benefits in all sorts of ways for individual well-being. It can also help with some of the stigma around, for example, hearing voices. You mentioned psychosis. Many people with psychosis struggle with frightening, abusive voices. They also have voices that are quite neutral and even positive. But lots of people with lots of other psychiatric conditions also experience voice hearing. Lots of people in the general population hear voices and are not troubled by them. And huge numbers of people hear voices in some sort of irregular, one-off kind of way. So a lot of my research in that respect has been about normalizing and saying, here are two ways in which the human mind is incredibly diverse. The regular, non-troubled mind that doesn't seek psychiatric help for hearing voices, that's a pretty diverse thing. There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on in your head. People who are troubled, that's also a really diverse thing. People who are troubled by voices, they come in all different shapes and sizes. They're different in number. They're different in quality in so many different ways, from voices that sound like there's actually somebody in the room with you to voices that don't actually sound like anything, that are experienced as a voice, but you couldn't put any detail on what kind of voice it was, whether it was a man or a woman speaking, what accent they had, what the pitch was, the timbre and tone, and so on. So there's just two huge baskets of diversity that kind of overlap. And it's both powerful for those who aren't troubled to be aware of that diversity and be less worried about having, for example, something that's a bit like a voice in the head. You really are not going mad. If you hear a voice speaking to yourself, you're doing some inner speech. But it's also helpful for people who are troubled and can see the connections. We try and help them see the connections between the thing that's troubling them and the regular everyday thing that they're probably also doing. They just may not be aware of it. So dialing into that diversity and trying to normalize some of these experiences that can become distressing actually helps. We find that with the therapeutic resource that we developed for particularly young people hearing voices, simply having this kind of conversation that we've had today about how the mind works, about how inner speech works, can be really beneficial. We're showing that in clinical trials at the moment.
Yeah, that's amazing. The community that I've been a part of and have studied for 15 years now is called Internal Family Systems. It's goes by IFS, and it's not really referring to. And I'm saying this for our listeners as well. It's not really referring to a family therapy model, but it refers to the inner dialogue of voices that act very much like a real family or a group of people act. There are factions. There's politics. There are scapegoats, dominant and non-dominant sides. And so once we begin teaching, my point is we at our conferences and all the books that people write about this, we are obsessing about this question, Charles, about how do we elucidate for somebody that this is possible, and especially those people who seem to be resistant to the idea. As you point out, I think very, very wisely, from my experience, it's not for everybody. And that's one of the first rules of thumb in our work is don't try to force this on somebody. That's the first way you're going to get them to, ignore it. But often we'll teach people things like, they'll say, I don't feel any, I don't hear anything, there's nothing going on. And we'll say, well, just give it some time. We'll also begin to teach them to notice subtle sensations in their body. And we'll find that those folks that have trouble imagining or going along with the idea that there are different voices, often they need a little bit of prompting. They need a little disinhibition prompt, which leads me to my question about disinhibition. Everyone in our society drinks alcohol and knows the sort of predictable effects of disinhibition. People speak more freely often. Somebody who's maybe very closed all of a sudden opens up and says everything. Maybe they say too much. We have actually worked a lot in the psychedelic community, in therapeutic community, psychedelic therapeutic community to, as you I'm sure are aware, that to utilize this tool of dissociation that some of these medicines provide that are much less toxic than alcohol. So is there a relationship between certain medicines that people can take advantage of, emerging medicine, psychedelics, and even just alcohol? Like, how does that affect all of this?
Yeah, I don't think we know that. I don't think there has been research really on that topic. I would expect there to be some differences. I think maybe the internal dialogue could become more obvious, more pronounced in such situations. It might be about disinhibition. It might be about a greater awareness, a greater ability to self-observe. But I think I'm just guessing. I don't think it's been done. As far as I know, we've done some work with ayahuasca and looking at how using ayahuasca can lead to voice-like experiences, which are often described as quite positive and creative. I guess that's why people do it. But it can also last quite a long time. People who've used ayahuasca can be having similar sorts of experiences some way into the future. But we're really just beginning to answer these, to ask these questions. I wouldn't be surprised to find some effects, and I think it's a great point of interaction and fruitful intersection between our lines of work and research to press on that a bit more and see what is going on there.
You mentioned negative aspects of internal dialogue. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's like I think inner speech is like a tool. Maybe it's like a Swiss Army knife or something. It's a multi-purpose tool that allows us to do so many different things. I mean, language is the most incredible tool. We can do so many different things with language. We can order a pizza, we can marry someone, we can divorce someone, we can condemn somebody to death. We can do so many different things with words. And all of those different functions, I don't think a single one of those functions is lost when we turn language back on ourselves. We can do just as many different things with words turned back on ourselves. So you'd expect it to have lots of benefits, and the benefits include, some of the things we talked about: planning behavior, figuring out what we're going to do, regulating our behavior, staying on track, planning for the future and so on, but also regulating our emotions. I think this is an area of research that will really grow in the years to come. Using inner speech just to keep ourselves together, to boost ourselves, to G ourselves up, to motivate ourselves, to be therapists to ourselves in some ways around our emotions. So there's some of the positives, but the negatives are we do a lot of beating ourselves up in words. We do a lot of critical self-talk, and it's pretty natural, it's pretty common, but it can become problematic. People in the clinical psychology world call this rumination, and as you know, it's a big thing in depression and anxiety. Using words, using verbal thoughts to dwell on a topic that you're probably better off not dwelling on quite so much. And so, just like any tool can be used for good effect and it can be used for a bad effect, and inner speech is just one of those tools. So being aware of the different roles it can play, the different functions it can have, I think is going to be beneficial.
Yeah. You remind me that how when we're traumatized by something or shocked by something, the brainstem sort of seems to be in charge more than other parts of the brain for a while to regulate our source of safety and find safety and comfort. And hypervigilance is one of those features of like PTSD. It's they're paying attention to the accident, how it happened, where they were when it happened, all the details, and all the memories are coming back. So it's so problematic. Sometimes this brain that we have works really well, and other times it seems to work against us.
But I think it's a fruitful area for research as well, because, as I say, people have talked about rumination in clinical research for a long time, but they haven't really stopped to think, actually, what you're talking about here is inner speech. And there's this whole field of research over here that isn't really clinically focused, but that could be really valuable in thinking about what are words in the head? How do they work? What are they like? How do they vary? So there's a lot of potential there for enriching kind of both lines of inquiry by bringing those two things together. And for PTSD as well, what are the intrusive memories, the flashbacks and so on? What medium do they come in? We often think of flashbacks as being visual. That's where the metaphor comes from. It's really a metaphor from the study of cinema. But a lot of that stuff must be verbal as well. A lot of it is coming into the head as words. What does that mean? Voice hearing in relation to PTSD is a growing area of research, thinking about how effectively some PTSD symptoms are a kind of voice hearing. So maybe thinking about them in that sense can give us new sort of angles on them, new handles to work with.
There are obviously so many different avenues and paths that this research can go right now, especially with where we are in the research. What are you most excited about in the future that can be looked at and dug into?
I think what I'm really keen for research to do is not treat inner speech as just one thing. Okay, if you studied people speaking out loud and all you did was count how many words they say or how fast they speak, I don't think you'd really learn a lot about people. If you ask what words do they use, what do they say with their words, what kind of words do they use, what functions are those words performing or being intended to perform, then you're going to learn something about people. So simply thinking about inner speech as something that is either on or off, or that you do a lot of or you don't do so much of, I don't think it's very useful. It's much more interesting to ask what kind of inner speech people use. What functions do they use it for? What do they do with their words? What structure does it have? How does that relate? How does form relate to function? And so on. So I really hope, and I think there are signs that people are starting to do this. We were really the first team in the world to say, let's look at the different kinds of inner speech. Let's ask people not how much inner speech they're doing, but what it's like. And since then, people have run with that idea, and our scale has been translated into loads of different languages. It's been used in studies all around the world, and people are now starting to tie it in with different patterns of brain activation. So we talked about dialogic inner speech, for example, this inner speech that has a form of a dialogue. There are other important variables. Sometimes your inner speech is more highly condensed, so it's like a compressed telegraphic, squished together kind of note form version of what you'd say out loud, and other times it's more expanded. It's more like a fully formed sentence. Those differences, I think, are going to be really interesting to study, and I think that's where research is going. I certainly hope so. What has happened instead, largely because of some hijinks on the internet, which exploded a few years ago when a blog post came to light that seemed to suggest that sometimes that some people don't have any inner speech. And what you had was half the world saying, what? You mean there are some people who don't use any internal narrative? And the other half of the world was saying, what? You mean there are some people who use internal narrative? And that was fun. And it's led to an explosion of interest in this topic, which is great, except that 10 years ago when I was publishing my book, I'm like, I'd love you to know about inner speech. And of course now right, everybody's talking about it. And I'm like, hello, I've done a book on this topic. But anyway, that's all fun. It helps to get people interested. And when people are interested in a topic, then research can start to happen with it. But it really is much more important to ask, not do you use inner speech or don't you use inner speech, but what kind of inner speech do you use and what do you use it for?
You're a writer, and you've written both nonfiction and fiction, and those are different styles, right? Creating a character is a form of, I imagine, a more advanced form of inner speech, where there's a whole bunch of aspects that have to be created in that to create that consistent object. Tell us about your writing, and what do you enjoy? Do you enjoy both? Because I have a hard time reading fiction. It's harder for me to do fiction. How about you?
Well, it's been my love since childhood. I've been making stories and writing novels since I was a child, literally. I find it fulfills me, it excites me, it satisfies me, it challenges me emotionally in ways that nothing else does. So I'm committed to it. I will never stop doing it. I absolutely love it. And I love it for all sorts of reasons. One way in which this question is relevant to inner speech is in terms of thinking about characters. So, you're sitting there, you're making up these characters. For me, and I think quite a few writers, the thing that gets you going is hearing a character's voice. And I don't mean I'm hearing a voice from the corner of the room in the way that somebody who was troubled by distressing voices might say they hear voices. But rather something forms in my head and I can start to think like, or talk to myself like that character would. If I could put some magical probe inside that fictional character's head, I'm starting to hear and see what their mind is like. And that's exciting because it means you've got a chance of getting a story going. It's exciting because you're then able to create something which I think no other art form can do, which is creating a consciousness on the page. Creating, if you like, software for the reader's mind that allows them to simulate how somebody else lives. And that is an incredibly powerful tool. That is so important for our well-being, for our understanding of each other. It's a wonderful thing. And, kind of movies can do that as well to an extent, but written fiction, I think, has the uniquely powerful ability to use words to make a consciousness and to make that consciousness breathe and live. So that's a big part of it, figuring out what is going on in someone's head. Actually, then writing a character, a lot of the time you are writing their thoughts. And so knowing, I find it interesting when I read a novelist who seems to have some insight about inner speech and consciousness in general and how consciousness works, but seems to capture something of what I think realistic inner speech is like. So it's one of the ways in which novels become such a powerful art form. I've been doing some work with the video games, which are obviously not as far developed as fiction, as novels. They just haven't been around so long. Video games tend to be very much on the surface. It's all about how things look and sound and, game devs do amazing things with how things look and sound in a video game world. But what they don't usually do is think about what's going on in a character's head. They don't allow you to live a person's mind in the way you can live a person's mind in a novel, in a film. And what I'm saying to games studios is, if you take that step, if you listen to this sort of, me talking about the science of inner experience and other people who work on this stuff, your characters might come to life a bit more, and then your narratives become more interesting, and your projects, your products, your works of art become enhanced, come closer to that level of great literature or great cinema. And there's a lot of interest in the idea. Lots of people are saying, actually, yeah, video games need to do something like that. And so I'm working with some studios to help them to understand how they can bring characters alive in the way that you can do so in fiction.
If you could meet J.K. Rowling, what would you want to know about her?
Well, we have done some research with professional writers who have not J.K. Rowling, but others, some quite famous writers who went through the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and we talked to them about exactly this question. It's become a bit of a cliche, writers, the idea that writers hear the voices of their characters. And as you can expect from a bunch of diverse human beings, you get every opinion from, yes, that's exactly what it's like. I really feel like I'm listening to somebody speaking to me, all the way through to, don't be so stupid. Of course, I don't listen. I don't hear my characters' voices. I'm in charge here. I write what they're going to do. And you get that whole spectrum. So you just cannot generalize about how writers work. The one thing I would say that is quite common when you ask writers, and I don't know what J.K. Rowling would say, she may well have said something relevant in interviews, but many writers say it's not so much hearing the voice of a character because it's not addressing you. My writers generally don't address me, but I hear them. It's almost like I'm eavesdropping or I'm overhearing them. And that's kind of where it should be, because if my characters were conscious of me, that's like some sort of metafictional nightmare. You want to keep the author out of the story. I think there's only one exception to that, and that's when I'd finished writing a novel that I really loved and I'd really put my heart into it. And I was faced with actually a sequel involving two of the same characters, a sequel to a previous novel. So I'd written these two novels about these two characters, and I was faced with, the struggle that you have to find a home for these characters and these books in the world. It's really not easy, and that's one of the only times my characters have spoken to me, and they were just they were standing in a field, which was part of one of the later scenes of that second novel, and they just said, keep going.
I love that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, tell people where they can find you, and if there's any other things you want people to know about what you're working on currently, and how to learn more about this and read some of your books.
Yeah, sure. It's all there on my website, which is charlesfernyhough.com. The book on inner speech is called The Voices Within, published in the US by Basic. The novels are all there on the website as well, and also stuff with the video games and anything else that I've said that might be of interest. You can find me through that. And I'd also say that if anybody is concerned about anything like hearing voices, part of a project that I was involved in, we put together a website, an information resource called understandingvoices.com. Understanding Voices, all one word, no dots. And you'll find everything you need there if you have any questions about voice hearing, about how common it is, about what you can do about it. So, yeah, those are the places I'd point people to.
That's great.
I look forward to picking out some of your books and taking a look. And I enjoy a good challenge, Charles. Like I'd like to challenge myself to read more fiction and hearing about the way you talk about it's actually very compelling to hear you talk about how it means so much to you to write fiction. That in itself helps me start to begin to create a story that I can relate to, and then a door opens, and so maybe that's what I need.
It's your path towards fiction.
I need permission.
I keep telling him it's so helpful for creativity and everything to read some fiction.
Okay, be careful, because writing is my therapy. So you guys are out of a job.
I would love it if everybody did more writing. I would love it. It's just, I'm a writer as well. I write in a more linear way, and I've tried to write fiction. Again, I think it's something for me, maybe in the next half of my life, that's something I work on as far as like cracking that puzzle. Because it seems like there's a lot of rewards there, not just for entertainment, but for, like you said, substantial meaning and learning about yourself, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So,
thank you so much.
I enjoyed this. Yeah, thank you, Charles.
It's been a great pleasure. Lovely to talk to you about this stuff and to hear about your work. And as I say, there are so many interesting intersections. I hope in the future people will be exploring them and finding out more things about this miracle of the diversity of our inner world.
Yeah,
for sure. It's important work. Thank you for doing it.
I would love to put you in touch with the people that run the conference, the IFS conference. You'd be a star at that conference in our community. Are you familiar with IFS?
Yes, I know. A few people have said this is really relevant to what I'm doing, and I just haven't really had the chance to explore too much yet. Yeah. They're quite influential here in the States as far as kind of steering the course of like what modern psychotherapy looks like here, and sort of standard of care. So. Love to keep up with what you're doing. Are you still doing research on this actively? Yeah, I kind of divide my time between academic life and my various writing projects. Cool. Yes, I'm lucky in being able to do both.
Great. Well, pleasure to meet you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tripping Over Love. Subscribe now to make sure you get the latest episode, and drop us a comment or a question. See you next time.